So we're talking about creating a message that reaches your community. And how many times do we say this? They just don't understand. We seem to say that about donors. We lament, that foundations don't really understand us. Sometimes churches and pastors don't understand us, and so that's a common refrain that we all say kind of in this marriage space, or we say they just don't get it. They just don't understand. They don't get it. Well, we're going to talk today about frames and how people unknowingly, how even we unknowingly operate with frames. And this comes out of a lot of the world of political science and how people think about problems that they're facing. Uh, but I want to start with a story with a guy named Stephen. So as you know, I built homes over many, many years, and I remember in 2015 I was finishing a house, and I had a gentleman there. He was there in the house by himself that day. He was doing the tape and float. He was using a trowel to float the seams on the drywall. And I walked in, and immediately I noticed that he really had a unique gift. What I really noticed is he held the trowel differently than anyone I'd ever seen hold a trowel. And he was able to float these really wide seams with just perfection. And I noticed it was so remarkable that I just kind of stood there for 5 or 10 minutes and just watched him work. It just seemed artistic. And so when I caught a moment with him, I asked him, I said, Stephen, do you do any artwork? And he said, well, he says it's interesting that you say that, because he said when I was a sophomore in high school, a teacher looked over my shoulder and noticed that I was drawing something that was really well done, and I was kind of discovered in my high school. And he said that as the years progressed in high school, he moved into the arts program, and one of his teachers began to advocate for him. And as he was graduating from high school, he was awarded a full ride scholarship to NYU. And I was just so taken by that story. And I said, Stephen, so how did that go? And he looked at me with a puzzled look, and as if I didn't understand. And he said, I didn't go. And I'm like, what? And he goes, oh yeah. He said, my dad needed me in this business. And I remember my reaction to that, because my reaction was along this line. I I felt that it was a loss for him, that he had missed an opportunity, or some people might say he had missed a chance to discover his full self. People say that a lot. But as I've told this story, other people have come with a different frame, and they've said things like, wow, how inspiring. He acted with such great character. He was focused on his family and his community. What an honorable decision. Self-sacrifice is so inspiring. And what we're talking about here is there are two different frames that we've interpreted this story from. One frame, my frame, is individualism. That's the frame I interpreted it from, because I was thinking from his individual benefit. But a lot of people think from this frame of mutualism. And actually, these frames are very well established in different cultures. So Western cultures, meaning Western Europe, all of North America, even parts of South America, the dominant frame is individualism. Eastern cultures like Asia and certainly China and Japan, they all think from the frame of mutualism. And so, the individualism frame is, it was a loss. The mutualism frame was he acted with such great character. But this is a key that I want us to think about, is that people make choices based on their values and identities, even when those choices don't align with the facts or even their own best interest. Kind of interesting, isn't it? And this is a quote from a gentleman who's in the political sphere. His name is George Lakoff, and he has studied the social science of frames. And this is the real key that we need to internalize. He says, to be accepted, the truth must fit people's frames. If the facts don't fit the frame stays and the facts bounce off. And that's a really interesting concept to think about. And especially as we think about the dominant frame in the United States, the dominant frame in the United States is expressive individualism. And that frame is reinforced by two really strong emotional elements. It's reinforced by the personal pain that so many of us have felt around marriage and family. And it's also reinforced by cultural narratives on marriage, even if we don't agree with the facts of that. So there's two dominant frames for marriage specifically. One is a consent frame, and the other is the cosmos frame. Cosmos meaning we come with a faith-based frame. And Stephanie is going to send you an essay that we had created called The Lost Story of Marriage. We commissioned an essay by a cultural observer named David John Seal. And John Seal was the director of cultural engagement for the John Templeton Foundation. So he's a cultural expert, but he's also a man of devout faith. He's very passionate about marriage, and he helps us understand the unique frames that people have specifically in marriage. But let's talk about frames more specifically. And that is that number one, frames rule. It rules how we think. But also number two is increasingly people operating, they tend to operate from conflicting frames, conflicting metaphysical frames. So a conflicting frame is a young Christian couple who cohabitates. Those are conflicting frames, okay? Because cohabitation is not a biblical value. And so that's an example of conflicting frames. Thirdly, is that you must win the frame, but frames are not won by arguments. Like, for instance, our reasoned arguments is like we want to talk to them about our biblical values, our traditional values. We want to use kind of our culture war language, but it's ineffective. You don't reach people because, as George Lakoff says, our facts bounce off their frame. Their frame wins, no matter how we can potentially present our facts. But number five is frames are won by an engagement of the imagination. In other words, how we tell stories. And number six is a failure to win a frame guarantees losing the argument. So here's some framing strategies that we can use. Is first of all, identify your frame. What frame do you come from? And then choose a frame that you can use, but choose it intentionally, and then use that to frame your message. Anticipate counter frames. And I'll share with you a real life example of this, is that a lot of times when I advocate for marriage, when my facts bounce off their frame, people will say, well, you're just trying to take us back to the 1960s when patriarchy ruled. Okay, so what I've realized is that I need to anticipate this counter frame. And so the way I've changed my message is before people will even counter with that frame, I will address that frame. And so when I'm talking about the maybe a new marriage renaissance emerging in the United States, I will anticipate a counterframe by saying, now we're not talking about going back to the marriage of the 1960s, because the marriages in the 1960s weren't that great. My dad was a district judge. He ran the divorce mill. Marriage wasn't that great in the 1960s. So I'm anticipating a counterframe. And then adapt to your audience's values and beliefs if they align with yours. You don't want to adopt their values and beliefs. But when you can find common ground, and we're going to talk about this, those are some things that you can adapt to. So now let's talk about how you recognize your frame. Well, my frame is I frame everything from a faith-based perspective. I have traditional views, not only traditional views, but I view marriage in the traditional roles that people typically are in. This gets me a little trouble with my kids, you know. I frame things from a conservative viewpoint, okay? But as I'm choosing a frame, I realize that I've got to be strategic while still being authentic. And so what I want to do is I want to focus on some common values that maybe people don't agree with me might agree upon, like fidelity. Fidelity is a very common value, and especially fidelity in marriage. no matter what people believe about marriage, the vast majority of all people believe that fidelity is an important value for couples to have. People don't like cheating. And so that's a common value that I could tap into. The research says is that people are very, very much into commitment. People really value commitment and the idea of being committed to another person. The other thing that I've been learning about frames is to understand the innovations and perspectives. And this is what my kids have taught me, is they're teaching me kind of a different view of marriage that I think is still perfectly authentic to my view of marriage. But it's helping me understand the roles a little bit differently, being more flexible to the roles in marriage. I've gotten a lot of input on that lately. And also, I'm understanding sensitivities. Is this next generation, they are highly, highly sensitive. I don't know if you're hearing the word judging a lot. That's a really popular word right now. Everything is kind of in the judging category, so I need to anticipate that as I'm communicating. And again, what I said before, be careful with traditionalism. Things were not that great in the 1960s, so it's good to kind of think about that as we think about frames. And so, as I close today, I'm going to talk about some different reframes that have been really successful for us. One is reframing marriage as something far greater than a romantic notion. We're reframing marriage as the family leadership team. And you've heard me use the illustration of comparing the family leadership team to the leadership team of a sports team. So if if the Los Angeles Chargers if their coaching staff decided to split, and if that coaching staff was going to go two different directions, but the team still had to practice with both coaching staffs, right? But they were going to play on conflicting days of the week and they were going to run different plays. We would know that those new two sports teams would lose every game, right? Because when that leadership team is broken, that the team tends to fail. And so I've been reframing a lot in that context of family. What happens to families when that leadership team breaks and goes different directions and runs different plays of the family life during the week? It's a struggle for families. So that's kind of a reframe about what marriage is. The other reframe that we've been really successful with lately is identifying that really most social problems in reality are family systems problems. If you really think about the social problems we face in America, at their root, they're really all family systems problems. And solving social problems by strengthening the family is sometimes the most effective way we can solve them. And marriage is the family leadership team, so it needs to be part of how we solve social problems. And lastly, this is a reframe that has been very successful. I use this at the Texas Policy Summit. And how do we bring Democrats and Republicans together on the idea of strengthening marriages? This is something that we all agree upon. This is a common shared value across Democrats and Republicans, is that when fathers are present in the home, kids do better by every measure. So those are some examples of how we can reframe things so that we can communicate more effectively and reach more people as we do.